Hi everyone, this is lecture 5 of week 10. And again, you want to read the biblical story first before listening to this lecture. Otherwise, it's not going to make a lot of sense because I'm going to be going quite fast. Also, parts of the biblical text and other readings that I do not go over might show up on your quiz. Okay. As I stated last time, Saul and his son, by the end of 1 Samuel and the beginning of 2 Samuel, are dead. Okay. However, as the next couple of chapters in the book of 2 Samuel make clear, David is, however, unable to convince everyone right away that he is the legitimate king. Okay, and as a result, we are told that a civil war breaks out between David and his men under the leadership of his general Joab, and with Saul's heir Ishbaal and his general Abner. Okay, and this civil war, which is described in 2 Samuel 2-6, it takes a very, very long time to settle. Okay, however, slowly but surely, again, I'm going very fast, right? David manages to consolidate his rule by winning key battles against the lingering pro-Saul army, by persuading towns to come under his command, and by strategically killing people off. Okay, so this is a kind of quick list of all of what David does. And again, you want to read the biblical text. I am going very fast. Okay, so the first thing he does, as I described in the preceding video, David takes Michal back. Michal is the daughter of Saul, as she represents a legitimate claim to the Saulite throne. Okay, second, through a bunch of machinations, Abner, okay, Saul's very talented, actually, army general, is killed by Joab, David's general. Okay, then Ishbaal, Saul's descendant and heir, who is the one ruling in place, also dies as he is killed by his captives. Okay, notice how David's ascent is littered with bodies. Okay, and yet how in each case the text tells us David had nothing to do with it. I mean, he really did learn the lesson to keep his hands clean. Okay, Saul, Jonathan, other sons of Saul, Saul's assassin, Saul's general Abner, the heir apparent Ishbaal, and finally the two captains of Saul, these two captains who kill Ishbaal, they all end up dead. Okay, and every time their deaths benefit David, and yet we are told David had nothing to do with it. They just end up dead. Okay, we are also told, as part of this consolidation of David's power, that David brings Jonathan's son Mishbosheth, okay, who is a cripple, okay, into his house. And we're told, of course, this is a great mark of loyalty to that covenant. Okay, but likely one can read this as a way for David to keep a close eye on a legitimate contender for the throne. Okay, we are also told that David conquers Jerusalem, an old Jebusite. Okay, and Jerusalem is a really interesting place to conquer. It is a land that is not affiliated with a particular tribe. Okay, so it's a neutral ground, which is very interesting. Again, speaking to David's kind of political savvy. Okay, and Jerusalem, once it is conquered, David remakes it into a new capital. Okay, and Jerusalem will be known by a variety of names, okay? And it becomes so closely associated with David that it will be called the City of David, Jerusalem, the City of David, okay? Another older designation for Jerusalem is Zion, okay? And there's actually perhaps an even older designation. Sometimes you'll see it called Ariel, okay? The Lion of God. Okay, which is a very, very old designation of Jerusalem. Okay, so he captures Jerusalem, turns it into his new capital. He also builds a palace in his new capital. Okay, finally he moves the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem in 2 Samuel 6. Okay. And finally, in 2 Samuel 7, we are told that David tries to build a temple, a nice kind of shiny new building to house the Ark. Okay. However, for some reason, when David turns to build the Ark, okay, everything else works out for him. But when he turns to do that, all of a sudden, right, he's met with a bit of resistance or failure, or something goes awry. Okay. Now, just a note, David's, this attempt to build a temple for Yahweh, right? This is not necessarily a pious act. Okay. I mean, I know that it's the biblical text makes it seem like it's a super pious act. Really, it's a political act, okay? A temple in ancient times was not just an important religious symbol, but it was also a political symbol showing how this particular God, Yahweh, approved of, supported the rule of a particular king. That is David. Okay, so what a temple did was that it authenticated David's rule by integrating it with that of Yahweh. Okay, um, so it's a very politically savvy move. Okay, however, for some reason, okay, and again, for the first time with David, right? We are told this is not a go. Okay, this is and so turn to 2 Samuel 7 verse 4. Okay, we are told, but that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. Nathan is the same guy who, went to David after the Bathsheba thing. Okay, go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you the one to build me a house to live in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I've been moving around in the tent and the tabernacle. Wherever I have moved about among all the people of Israel, did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? God, for some reason, tells David, according to the story, that he doesn't want a temple. He likes camping out. He's like a super camping guy. Okay. And notice how God's reasoning is like not super convincing, nor very specific or makes any sense. Okay. For example, like if God likes tents so much, why does David's son get to eventually build God a temple? Does he only like sleeping in tents during the time of David? Okay. As evident by this rather not clear reasoning that's given, it seems that the biblical writers had trouble explaining why such a great, great, great pious guy like David, why he did not get to building a house for God. Okay, in Chronicles, a book that's much later, dated to the exile in the 4th or 5th century, David is said to have been not allowed to build a house for Yahweh because he has shed too much blood. Okay, so I mean, it seems like eventually people did fill in more reasons. Okay, I mean, I guess this reason also seems a bit weak. Okay, whatever. We don't know why. Some scholars think that maybe perhaps David didn't get to build a temple because there were some opposition groups. Maybe there were priestly oppositions. Again, we don't clearly know why he didn't get to do this. A lot of people think that perhaps his empire was not large enough to get all the resources, the forced labor, the money, the taxes really needed to build a temple. Okay. David, however, as always, does get a nice consolation prize from Yahweh for trying to build Yahweh a nice new house. Okay, we are told in 2 Samuel 7:11, right? This. Okay. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house, and when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. And he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son for me. And when he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod, such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. But I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Okay. There's a lot of wordplay in the Hebrew. Okay, it states that because David wanted to build God a house, God instead will nicely build David a house. And of course, there's kind of double entendre because a house can mean a family or a dynasty. Okay. Moreover, it states that that God will be a father to David's descendants, and his descendants will be like a son to him. Okay, what the text doesn't clearly tell you is that this language of divine sonship, okay, is found in other parts of the Near East to talk about a kind of this divine adoption of a king by a god, in which the king, at some point, for some, gets to be regarded or is regarded as quasi-divine. Okay, another way to put it is, this seems to reflect kind of a derivation of this idea of the divinization of kingship, where kings became gods. Okay, or quasi-gods or whatever. Okay, the Israelite writer uses the language of the divinization of human monarchs, but he doesn't go fully there. Okay, because he says, "Oh, they'll be like a son." Doesn't say that Solomon and these kings will be divine. Okay, of course, by the New Testament times, they do go fully there, right? And this promise to David is taken more literally, and Jesus, who is really David's descendants and really modeled after David, will be seen as divine or quasi-divine. Okay. David, moreover, is promised that his line to the throne will remain rule in Israel forever. Okay, and this promise is known by a bunch of fancy words, which will probably be tested on, called the Davidic promise or Zion theology. Okay, and this promise, the Davidic promise or the Zion theology, is where Yahweh promises to always protect the temple in Jerusalem and to promise that a Davidic heir will always sit on the throne of Judah, okay, or Israel. Okay, and this promise, the Davidic promise or Zion theology, lays the foundations for Messianism, which is a very complicated phenomenon. Okay, David's combining of religion and politics, in other words, is incredibly successful. So much so that later traditions will take up this earlier pattern and reshape it. In some cases, like with Christianity, literalizing the promises and literalizing the relationship between human kings and God by positing a kind of quasi-divine human hybrid king of some sort. Okay. The problem with what God promises in 2 Samuel 7, and the problem with the Davidic theology, Davidic promise and the Zion theology, is that what we know is that history contradicts it. Okay, meaning that what is promised there, it doesn't come true. Okay, David's line does not rule forever. Okay, rather, what we know is that Israel is destroyed, the north, or Israel is destroyed in 722 by the Assyrians, Judah is destroyed in 586, 587 by the Babylonians. This is all BCE, okay? And David's descendants at this point will never get to rule in Jerusalem again, okay? Indeed, in 2 Samuel 7, this chapter that I just read, it ends almost with a plea. Okay, a plea, a reminder, of God to remember his promises. Okay, as if already by this point things have been not going according to plan. Okay, and really this contradiction between the promises of God in the Zion theology and what actually happens in history, this is in part what leads to the Messianism. Okay, one of the ways that you can make sense of this failed promise that God will always reside in Jerusalem and that a Davidic heir will always sit on the throne of Judah, right? One of the ways that you can make sense of this failure, right, is to say, well, is to reinterpret it, right? Well, God didn't, what God really meant was that this will happen eventually. Eventually, God will place someone from the line of David, right, who by the New Testament times is literally the Son of God, eventually on the throne of Judah, inaugurating an eternal rule. Okay, and of course, notice, how that is indeed what happens. Okay, this is a very complicated topic, Messianism. I have just given you a tiny shortened blip here. Do not ask me about Messianism. This is really a topic for your New Testament professors who have more knowledge about this century when Messianism comes to the fore. Okay, whatever. The inability to build a temple is not the only failure on the part of David. Rather, by 2 Samuel 11 through 12. Okay, and afterwards. Really, the inability to build a temple really is a kind of shift. Okay, you notice a shift in the narrative at that point. Okay, where you start getting negative stories about David. Okay, and it's a really kind of dramatic shift. Okay, the most kind of evident version of this shift, right, or hint of this, is found in 2 Samuel 11 through 12, which details the kind of just this infamous story about David and Bathsheba, and it goes as follows. Okay, verse 1 and following. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. And it happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to inquire about the woman, and it was reported, oh, by the way, this is Bathsheba, son of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period, and then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent to David, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. Right? David, who should be out fighting, the text seems to imply, instead is lazing about, walking around the roof, sees a woman, Bathsheba, taking a purifying bath after her period, right? Telling you what? That the father of the child she conceives will definitely be David's child, right? And also maybe the fact that she's particularly fertile at this point, right? We are told that David lusts after her, has her brought to him, and then sleeps with her. She gets pregnant, but of course the problem is she has a husband, okay? Uriah. Now, Uriah is very, very, very interesting, right? Uriah is pictured as a very loyal outsider, a dedicated soldier, so dedicated, in fact, that when David brings him back from the front lines and gets him drunk in the hopes that he will go home and sleep with his wife so that her child, who is David's, can be passed off as Uriah's child, that Uriah, instead of going home, sleeps at the entrance of the palace, right? And he says, you know, when David asks him, why did you do that? Well, he said, well, how can I possibly go home and have fun while my fellow soldiers are out there fighting? So notice how well or positive Uriah is in contrast to David, okay? In the face of such loyalty by Uriah, David, we are told, is forced to take more dramatic action. He sends a note, that is, David sends a note to Uriah's commander telling him to place Uriah in a place where he is likely to be killed, okay? Which he does, and of course, Uriah dies. A short time later, we are told that David marries Bathsheba, Uriah's widow, and poof, no more paternity problems, right, or adultery problems, okay? Now, in earlier portions of 1 Samuel, David would have certainly gotten away with this, and likely the story would have been rewritten or tweaked, okay? Indeed, this is not the first time that David has done something kind of like this, that is, take someone else's wives and have the husband killed. Remember Abigail and Nabal in 1 Samuel 25, okay? Here, however, in contrast to that, notice how David is clearly depicted as the culprit. He is, you know, clearly the adulterer and the murderer, okay? For some reason, this story unflinchingly continues in its damning portrayal of David, okay? David is somehow, for whatever reason, there's a shift here. He's not allowed to get away with this murder. Okay. Rather, as a result of Uriah's death, we are told that Nathan the prophet, remember his name, Nathan comes up quite a bit here, is sent to confront David. And of course, in this beautiful little parable, again, I highly recommend you read the biblical text. You know, David uses a parable about this little sheep, okay, to basically hoist David on his own petard. That is to get David to admit to his own guilt. Okay. And oddly, we are told, again, I'm going very fast through the text, right? We are told that for David's sin, right? God comes back via Nathan. We are told that for David's sin, it is not David who will be punished, but his children. Okay. First, we are told that the innocent child of David and Bathsheba will die as a payment for David's sin. Okay. And we are told, of course, that this death of this child who is born and does eventually die really distresses David, who mourns and fasts. But soon afterwards, of course, we'll know that David has another child with Bathsheba. Okay, the second child is Solomon, or he's given a second name, Jedediah, beloved of the Lord. Okay, and notice the two names. Okay, remember that kings, right, are usually the ones who are double named, and this, of course, hints as to Solomon's future. Okay. However, like I said, it's not just the first child of David and Bathsheba that pays. Rather, God is not done yet. There's an additional payment for David's murder and adultery. The Lord states in 2 Samuel 12, verses 11, that he will, quote, raise up trouble from you, against you from within your own house, thus setting the scene for the next couple of chapters where a bunch of things happen to David's family. Okay, again, I can only summarize it here because I don't have time. We are told in these chapters that David's heir, Amnon, his firstborn son, rapes his half-sister named Tamar. Okay, this in turn will lead Tamar's full brother Absalom, the second-born heir, to murder Amnon. Okay, Absalom is a really interesting character. Okay, we are told that he is banished by his father for murdering his brother, but later allowed to return. However, Absalom remains very angry at his father for not doing anything. Okay, and eventually leads a nearly successful rebellion against David. Okay, so Absalom, who is said to be very beautiful, nearly is successful at getting David off his throne. Okay, yet, David, at the end, David still emerges the victor. okay? And notice how weird it is, David is punished to some degree, yes, but notice, right, he never loses the throne, right? Rather, it is his children who bear the brunt of God's punishment for David's sins, okay? And so there's a kind of misfit here, okay? So what is this negative story about David truly about? And why was it allowed to remain in this text, who, considering that this text was probably edited by people employed by the Davidic court? Okay? Well, to answer this question, you have to ask who benefits from this tale, okay? That is the tale of Bathsheba and David, okay? And there are two beneficiaries of this tale, interestingly enough. The first is Bathsheba. Yes, it's said that her first husband is dead, okay? We know that this is the result of this affair, but notice how Bathsheba, how well she ends up at the very end. She gets to become queen. We know that she will be the mother of the next king, right? This is probably way higher up than being the wife of a foreign soldier, okay? Indeed, notice how Bathsheba is portrayed as all kind of innocent and passive and wholly a victim here. Okay. However, scholars have wondered whether she is much more proactive than the text lets on. Okay. And that all depends on how one reads the story about Bathsheba and David. Okay. It states that David met Bathsheba when he happened to be walking around and looking from his roof and sees her bathing. Okay. However, what we are not told is how close Bathsheba's bathing location was to David's roof. Okay, notice the location makes a big difference in the story. If Bathsheba is like bathing 4 houses down from David's balcony, right, then David like has to get out his binoculars and he's like a real super creep here. Okay, however, another reading, if Bathsheba is bathing, let's say right across the palace, okay, strategically in front of David's roof, okay, then something very different is going on, right? Did she bathe in front of David intentionally? Or should we read her instead as this innocent lamb that failed to notice that David is like, staring at her while she's taking a bath? As I stated before, women, like men, have complex political ambitions and motivations, okay? Indeed, as we'll soon see, Bathsheba is depicted very differently in 1 Kings 1 as somebody who is instrumental in pushing her son to become the next king, right? Is Bathsheba always a passive victim? Was she kind of, did she pick up this ability after she marries David, or does she always have this ability, right? Notice how she is very obscure here, okay? Aside from Bathsheba, there is another person who benefits from this bad David story, and that is Solomon. Okay, notice that this affair between Bathsheba and David and the kind of repercussions, the divine punishments that result, right? This is the reason why the other contenders for the throne, namely Solomon's older half-brothers, such as the heir apparent, Amnon, and the next heir apparent, Absalom, right? This is why they both end up dead, right? Why? Because of this divine punishment against David for his crimes against Uriah. Okay, so it is the spare that not only leads to Solomon being born, but also to Solomon being pushed up as a possible contender to the throne. Okay, moreover, notice that the story also really helps to make Solomon look better by kind of a negative comparison. Okay, indeed, it was not unusual for kings who took over to try to make their predecessors look really bad. Right, this is probably why I guess Trump wants to make Obama look bad. Okay. Indeed, it is telling that in the very same story in which you find Solomon mentioned for the first time, you find this first openly negative story of David. The story allows Solomon to belittle his predecessor, his father, and in so doing, sets up the context for the more glorious, better reign of Solomon that will follow. Okay. Lastly, not only does this story make Solomon look better than David, his predecessor, but there are clues in this text that hint that Solomon, or likely writers appointed by Solomon, are using the story as David used his stories, right, to address some rumors and charges. And the main rumor or charge seems to have centered on the legitimacy of, the paternity of Solomon. Considering Bathsheba was married to someone else right before becoming pregnant with David's child, there appears to have been questions about who's Solomon's real daddy was. Okay, was he really, fathered by David or some other guy? Okay, and this might be the reason why we have the story. Okay, David and Bathsheba admit to the affair here, but notice, right, how the first child of the affair is mysteriously punished with death, right? Why does the child have to die? Okay, what did he do? I mean, he didn't do anything, right? And again, the point is, the question is not what the child did, but what utility is, results from having this first child die. Okay, by having the first child of David and Bathsheba kind of divinely killed off, the narrator argues that Solomon, who is born after his parents are rightfully married, okay, that he is really, really, really the son of David, okay, not the son of possibly Uriah. No, the son of Uriah, or the son whose paternity is a little, no, he was killed off. Why? Because that's part of God's punishment for David's misdeed. Okay. Indeed, as this story shows, now, so we'll see a little bit more in the next video, David's political abilities seems to have been even outmatched by those of his son Solomon. Okay, who is even more efficient, more political savvy, and perhaps even more brutal a ruler than his father was.